So we've seen how atmosphere can act in conjunction with a sunlit shot, but now let's move on from there. I want to show you a whole other subset of atmospheric perspective, and this one happens when we look directly into the light. That is, when the sun, or whatever the light source is behind everything and shining through the atmosphere. Hollywood loves this kind of atmosphere because it's so seductive and suggestive, with visual language that at its essence is really just a series of silhouetted shapes that overlap each other, as in this frame from the movie Gladiator. Here's another frame from Gladiator, and this one's great for showing how even though Russell Crowe is close to the camera, all the details of his face are obscured by this heavy atmosphere. It's no longer about detail, it's about shape, pure shape. And you can see how the cinematographer has really designed this frame only working with the language of shapes, which should really remind you of what we talked about in week number 1, pure composition. Let's go back to this diagram for a second in order to understand what's actually happening here and what's causing this obfuscation of detail. So unlike a regular sunlit scene where the sun is maybe behind us or off to the side, when you look directly into the light source, in this case indicated by the sun, is directly opposing the viewer, and it has to shine through all that atmosphere to get to our eyes. Now, if you think of atmosphere as millions and millions of little particles, which it is, that means that the sunlight is glinting off the backs of each of those particles, causing this kind of overblown backlight effect. And the way we register that visually is through a loss of detail. Looking at this photograph, you can just imagine all those millions of atmospheric particles that are compounding as you get further away in depth. And what that means is that sunlight is just reflecting and bouncing off them like crazy, causing a dramatic lightening of value as you step back in distance. It's almost as if the atmosphere is like a veil, and the veil gets thicker as you go back, but in this case the veil is made of light. There is another critical observation to make in this type of light, and it's kind of like a defining fingerprint for when you look into the light. Because the light source is placed behind everything, we are now at the correct angle to receive highlights that glint off objects. As you can see in this photograph, there are some highlights poking through, and that again is a direct reflection of the light source, as we know from week number 2. Because the light is behind everything, it is at the correct angle to give us highlights. And what's super interesting to me is that these light highlights pierce right through the atmosphere. They cut through that atmosphere like a knife with perfect clarity, and it makes for a dramatic value contrast. And these scenes are incredibly fun to paint because suddenly you don't have to think about average light, average shadow anymore. I mean, technically, because the light is behind everything, that means everything is in shadow. You largely don't even have to think about temperature that much because the atmosphere is kind of bullying everything to be one temperature. All you got to think about is big overall design of shapes. And then to break that up, you can have these piercing highlights cut right through that atmosphere for really high drama. The other common time of day where this is likely to occur is at sunset. Because the sun is so low on the horizon, it's very easy to put yourself in a position where you're looking directly into that light. And that's exactly what Paul Lesane is indicating here. And you'll notice at sunset and at sunrise, something very interesting happens to the atmosphere. No longer is the atmosphere blue like I've been demonstrating so far. Now the atmosphere is red, which is super interesting. You can see how instead of things going blue and cool back in the atmosphere, it's completely the opposite. Things are getting warmer as distance increases and cooler as they come closer. During sunset, the particles of the atmosphere are not blue like in my previous demonstration, they're actually red. And again, this happens at sunset and at sunrise. The sun, when sitting low on the atmosphere, completely reverses the normal temperature and turns the atmosphere warm. The effect is that things become bathed in this warm color. And it's for that reason that people commonly refer to this lighting as magic hour or golden hour. Now, it's actually quite difficult, by the way, to photograph this light. For some reason, cameras, unless you're a real skilled photographer, cameras don't really capture this properly. They overblow the warmth and almost force things to become an analogous palette rather than a more balanced palette. Now, certainly that's okay. These photos are beautiful in and of themselves, but if we look back at this Paul Lesane painting, you'll notice the color temperatures are much more balanced. And what that does, actually, I think, it helps the warms punch out more when you balance them with cools. And this is actually what real life looks like, more so than the photographs. No matter what time of day you're painting, one thing all atmosphere has in common is that they make the shapes lighter as you progress back in distance. It's the basic, reliable characteristic of all atmospheric conditions. But remember, if you have highlights, those can still come through strongly. And the two slides you just saw are watercolors by Joseph Zbukvich, and there's actually a fancy French term for this kind of painting. It's called contre-jour, French for painting directly into the light. In other words, paintings that are dominated by atmosphere. Contre-jour effects are so interesting that often you don't need much else to make an interesting picture. These two color keys by Paul Lassagne for Lord of the Rings are a good example. The top one looks like some kind of exaggerated afternoon atmosphere, as in things are getting bluer and lighter as they recede, and then the bottom one showing the reverse, the atmosphere present during magic hour, things getting warmer and lighter. But notice that both of these color keys have highlights that are piercing through that atmosphere. That water is directly reflecting the sun, and it's just coming through as a bright white value. Concept artists love this contre-jour thing because it gives you very alluring pictures while also yielding fairly easy drawing. This is a painting I did for a concept for a music video, and you can see the final effect is fairly eye-catching, but at its root it's just a bunch of rectangular shapes that are progressively stepping back in value, that is getting lighter and lighter with distance. And because I've chosen the sky to be kind of a cool gray, my temperatures also get cooler and cooler as you go back. Also, let me remind you here that edges get softer as you go back, so things have this melting effect, merging together with distance. This painting is also a good example of what happens when small shapes get put up against large areas of atmosphere. Look at that background middle building. The base of that building is connected to a whole series of larger shapes that make up the city. But as that building rises and towers above the other buildings, its shapes become more vulnerable to the sky. They're more exposed, and they're also quite a bit smaller. So take a look at what happens to the value scale as I sample from bottom to top. You see at the top it's much lighter than at the bottom. This illustrates the example of how atmosphere engulfs smaller shapes. So this is something very subtle you can do to really enhance believability. Smaller shapes will get engulfed by the atmosphere, causing values to get closer. And again, with enough distance, if you look at the buildings the farthest back, there is no delineation from one building to the next. It just merges into one value. That is true of sunlit scenes, overcast scenes, whatever atmosphere you can imagine. At the farthest distance, everything is one value.